Hey crafter, it's Amanda here. Welcome to my channel Crafters Autonomous, and today we are going to be talking about yarn. Specifically, I'm going to be answering the question, what is dye lot and why does it matter? So let's start with question number one, what is dye lot? According to Wikipedia, a dye lot is a record taken during the dyeing of yarn to identify yarn that received its coloration in the same vat at the same time. Okay, that's not very helpful. Basically, a dye lot, and in this case we're talking about yarn, but a dye lot of yarn means this whole clump, this whole section, this whole lot of yarn was dyed at the same time in the same batch of dye. This is a general term used just across all kinds of textiles. So for example, these curtains behind me, my mom finally put up curtains in this room, and these curtains had a dye lot, meaning that when these curtains were made, this batch or this lot of curtains were all dyed at the same time. And so because they're all dyed from the same dye at the same time, the thinking is the colors will match and be consistent. So a good way I like to illustrate this is think about you're making some cupcakes and you've mixed up some frosting and you're gonna frost your cupcakes. So you have your little bowl of frosting and you decide to add some food coloring. So you've got a little bowl of frosting, you add, let's say 3 drops of green food coloring, you mix it all in, and now you've got some green icing and you ice your cupcakes. Well, the little bowl you started with wasn't enough. So what do? You make another bowl of icing, you add 3 drops of green and you mix it in. But unless you use the exact same amount of frosting, you're gonna end up with different colors. So let's say there was less frosting here. This is gonna be a dark green, but our second batch we mixed up isn't gonna quite match exactly if, say, we had more frosting, and so it might turn out lighter. That's kind of the idea of dye lot. So with this icing cupcakes illustration, basically this batch of frosting would be one dye lot, and this batch of frosting would be another dye lot. And if you've ever done that, you know it's really hard if you don't make enough from the beginning to get your coloring to match exactly. So when you buy yarn, most yarn comes from a dye lot. Sometimes yarns don't come from a dye lot, and usually if they don't, they'll say no dye lot, and that's kind of a different topic. We weren't going to worry about that today. But when you buy yarn from a dye lot, which is pretty much most standard yarns, if you look on the packaging, you'll find something that says like lot number. Sometimes they say dye lot versus just lot number, but it gives you this number. The number itself isn't really important, but what is important is that all your yarn for your project comes from the same dye lot that it matches. So this one here is 630028. If I were buying multiple skeins of this yarn, I would want to make sure that this came from dye lot 630028 and my second skein also came from dye lot, what was it? 630028. Again, like I said, the number doesn't really have any significance other than you want the numbers to match to show that they're from the same dye lot. Here's a skein left over from some baby yarn. I just recently designed and made a baby blanket. It's on my Etsy. I'll go ahead and link that up there down below. You can go check that out if you want. But anyways, I needed multiple skeins of yarn for that. So actually my mom picked it up for me because she's awesome like that. And what I told her before she went was, I said, I'm gonna need at least 2 skeins of this yarn. Please make sure they're from the same dye lot. So when she bought the yarn, she looked on the packaging and she found, okay, this skein had this dye lot. And then when she bought the second skein, she made sure that the dye lot matches. So now we understand a little bit about what dye lot is, how to find it on your packaging. So let's answer question number 2. Why does it matter? Who cares if they were dyed at the same time, you might be thinking. Well, if you think back to our frosting illustration, if you don't have the exact same amounts and the dye isn't mixed properly, or if there's a slight variance, it can create a huge difference in the appearance of your yarns. This is actually really fun. This is a skein that I got from my great-grandmother when she sent me all her yarn when she wasn't able to crochet anymore. But on the back here, this is yarn from Kmart. They have a dye lot here, but then they also had this little blurb here about dye lot. And so here they actually put a reminder on the label. I thought this was kind of fun. But you want to make sure it's from the same dye lot so that way it matches and is consistent in your project and you don't notice that the yarn seems different. So I have personally found that dye lot is important because it can impact both the color and the texture of the yarn. So first of all, with color, obviously if you're working on a project and you're working in a color, but you need more of that same color, you want it to match. You don't want it to clash, because I have purchased yarn, I'm gonna show you something in a bit here, that yeah, when it doesn't match, it's very bad. It doesn't look very good. So you want to make sure that your projects turn out well. If you're going to buy the yarn, take the extra 2 seconds to double check the dye lots. I've also found that dye lot can play a role in texture. Again, I've got something I will show you in a minute to illustrate this, but there's a few reasons why it can also impact the color. So first of all, some different types of dyes just take to different materials differently. So for example, maybe a green dye absorbs in one way on a yarn, and a yellow dye absorbs in a different way. And this is kind of a made-up example, but the concept holds. So you may find that the green yarn is a little rougher and maybe the yellow yarn is a little softer just because of the color of the dye, because it's different chemicals and just the chemistry of it all can impact the texture. Something you can do if you want to get a feel for what I'm saying here is if you go to a yarn store and you look at the same packages of yarn but in different colors. So for example, if you went to Hobby Lobby and look at their, I love this yarn, so I've got a white and I've got this Quarry Days. I don't know if I'm saying that right. For the most part, these yarns are going to be basically the same, but they might feel a little bit different if the different dyes kind of play a role in how the fibers feel. Most of the time, it's not going to be a huge difference. You're not going to notice a huge texture difference between different colors. But I have found with Red Heart yarn, their Super Saver, that certain dyes and certain colors of yarn turn out way softer and others are way more rough. I think I bought a thing that was like a green one, and it was really soft, surprisingly soft for Red Heart yarn, and then I had a red one, same basic yarn, but just a different dye color, and so the red yarn was a little bit rougher. So because the different colors use different dyes, obviously those could be different in texture, but even the same color can cause a difference in texture, and I think that's not so much because of the dye itself, but because let's say they made a batch of yarn. So they've got the basic skein of yarn, and then they send it to be dyed, and it gets dyed. Often the batch of yarn that they make all at once is the same batch that gets dyed all at once. Well, let's say that they make a batch A, send it off to get dyed, and then they make batch B of yarn and send it off to get dyed as well. Well, maybe batch B, the yarn, they might have had some issues, or it might have just used a different material, and let's say yarn B turned out softer than yarn A. Well, when they go through the dye, even if the colors match, the texture can be different just because they were from different batches of yarn. So generally speaking, if they're from the same dye lot, they're also from the same manufactured batch of yarn. All right, so enough of me talking. Let me show you a project where I messed up. And you know, it was one of those things I just had to accept. But basically, many a moon ago, I found this Red Heart pattern to make a snowflake blanket. It's super pretty. I love how this stuff turned out. And this is one of my first like big projects that I ever crocheted. It took me probably like 5 or 6 years. Not because it takes that long, but just because I was bouncing to different projects. So anyways, I kind of knew about dye lot when I was first starting on this project, but I was also kind of like, you know, does it really matter? Is it gonna make that big of a difference? I wasn't super focused on it. So I started making this project and I bought how many skeins they told me to, but I was getting close to being done and I realized, you know, I want this blanket to be bigger. It just wasn't long enough for me. I couldn't cover my feet. My feet would be sticking out when I used the blanket. So I decided to go ahead and pick up some more yarn to make this blanket a little bit bigger. So I went to AC Moore back when AC Moore was a thing. Rip AC Moore. I went to go pick out more of this blue yarn. And you know, the yarn's variegated, first of all. So I was like, you know, how important is it gonna be? It's gonna all blend together. It's variegated anyways. Yeah, so I went to grab the yarn and it was the same color, the same type of yarn, but obviously from different dye lots because I bought them like 5 years apart. And the minute I picked up the yarn, I knew something was different because the yarn felt extremely soft. So, which is a good thing because you want your blankets to be soft, but Red Heart yarn typically isn't a very soft yarn. So I was kind of like, that's a little strange. And then I brought it home and I was looking at it and they were totally different colors. So I'm gonna show you this, and it might be hard to see on camera, but this is the second batch of yarn that I picked up from a different dye lot. It felt a little thinner, a lot softer, and the colors are different. So let me show you right where the change happens in the blanket. All right, so the change happens like right in here. These ones on this side are from the new yarn, the ones on the left are from the old yarn. It's a little bit hard to see on camera, but the blues are very different. In person, you can see it a lot, and it's this light blue here that is very different. So like this blue right here does not match the light blue over here. You can see how that's lighter. So this light blue right here is supposed to match that light blue, but this right here is a lot lighter than that light blue because, again, from different dye lots. So my blanket basically has this right-hand side is a different texture, different color, and yeah. Again, the camera's really not doing this justice. Unfortunately, because it is variegated, it does blend together a little bit, but even with it being variegated yarn, it's super obvious. I always notice it when I look at this blanket. And so since that day, I have always made sure that when I purchase yarn for a specific project, number one, buy enough yarn to complete the project, and number two, buy it all in the same dye lot. The good news is most of the time you're not going to run into that problem. Most of the time yarn manufacturers are really good about keeping it consistent from batch to batch, but there's no guarantees, and so it's just a good practice to make sure you get it all from the same dye lot. Again, it won't always make a big impact like it did with my blanket. You know, sometimes you can get it from one dye batch and another dye batch, put them side by side and not notice a difference at all, and that's always awesome when that happens, but this can happen, so it's good practice to buy from the same dye lot. But there you go, that is what yarn dye lot is, and this is why it matters. I hope that this video was helpful and informational for you. If you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell notifications so you know when I post videos. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving a thumbs up and commenting down below. I'd also love to hear if you have ever had issues where you bought yarn from different dye lots. Share your stories down below in the comments so we can all mourn together the mixed match yarn struggles we face. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy crafting.